Hey guys, and welcome back. So in this skill right here, we're going to be focusing on the Linux file system, and we will focus that attention around the basic operations of the Linux file system. So the first thing we will talk about is how the Linux file system is actually structured, its basic architecture, and then we will talk about being able to mount particular file systems on our system. So there are two different ways that we can actually mount our system. We can mount it in a manual way, whereby we have to go in via the CLI and type in some particular commands and specify what it is we are looking to mount and where the mount point should be. We will cover that within this skill right here, but we will also talk about how we can automatically do this process, and also what we're going to cover is dealing with swap space. Very, very important with the management of our system. So a lot of cool things to get to within this skill right here. The very first thing I want to talk to you about is that Linux file system. How about we roll up our sleeves and get going then? So now, when we are talking about a file system, what is it we actually mean here? This might be a quite esoteric term if you haven't really dug in and explored it. Now, we have two different branches of file system that we can have. The very first one is a physical file system, and the second type happens to be a virtual file system. So what do we mean when we talk about a physical file system? Now, a physical file system are really just used to store data and organize that data on a device. So that may be something like, say, for example, a RAID device. Now, we actually haven't really dived into RAID quite just yet, but we use RAID as a form of redundancy within our system administration. However, it doesn't have to be a RAID device. It could be a particular partition on a device and more. But when we're talking about a virtual file system, how on earth does that actually differ? Well, really, when we're talking about a virtual file system, what we are talking about are what the end users actually interact with when they happen to be using the particular operating system, so that if you happen to go in via the CLI and we do an ls and we go into a directory and you access a particular file, what we're actually doing here is working with the virtual file system. Now, the reality is the virtual file system itself is actually utilizing physical file systems. So the virtual file system is how we are actually interfacing with the system, but it will be pulling information from real live devices, real partitions, you know. Say, for example, this could be disk 1, which is a hard disk, and then maybe an SSD here as well. We are pulling from these physical file systems and presenting it to the user via the virtual file system where they can actually interact with this information. Now, here is the thing. What we actually do is we ultimately carve up our system, and we carve it up into different partitions. So this might be one partition, this might be a second partition, so on and so forth. But one thing we have to do is we have to put a file system onto the partition. Now, we do have some different file systems that we can actually put onto a partition, and we'll mention what they are very, very shortly. But understand right now, we have a disk, we can carve it up into partitions, and we want to put file systems onto that partition. Now, here is the rub. Just by simply carving up a disk like so, and putting a file system onto a partition, it does not mean the end user can actually access that file system. If we want to be able to access a particular file system, we have to mount it. And once we actually mount the file system, that will present that file system to the end user so that they can actually interact with that file system. Otherwise, it just is, like I say, inaccessible. Now, this is what I'm talking about when I'm referencing the physical file system and the virtual file system. With respect to Linux, we have what we know is a directory tree structure. So if I go to the root directory, if I happen to type the command tree, we're going to see a very, very massive tree-like structure. Now, this presents way too much information if I just limit the output here, just so we only go 2 folders down and hit enter. If I scroll on up, you can actually see the relationship going on. At the very top of the tree, we have this root directory, and within that we have the bin directory and the boot directory, and then the CD-ROM. And within these directories there are files and further directories. This is the directory tree we're talking about. So when we want to mount a particular file system, we want to mount it somewhere within this directory tree-like structure. So as we saw there, we could have our root directory right here, and then branching off we may have, say for example, the boot directory, and at the same level we may have, like they say, the dev directory, so on and so forth. Now the reality is, the way this actually works is that different disks are mounted at different points in the directory structure. So right here, in my situation right here, at the root directory, we have SDA5. So this is the first disk and it's partition number 5. That is actually accessible when I go to the root directory. However, when I switch and go to the boot directory, I'm actually accessing SDA1. So I'm accessing the same disk, but I'm actually accessing a completely different partition. So think about this, okay? We have this disk here, disk 1, okay? But it is partitioned. So when I'm in the root directory, I'm actually accessing this big portion of the disk, this large chunk here, okay? All this part here. However, just by simply typing the command cd boot, I move into the boot directory, and that is actually mounted within a different partition. So think about what is actually happening. Just by me typing the command cd, I'm working through the virtual file system, but under the hood, I'm actually accessing different partitions, or it might even be different disks entirely, however I choose to mount a particular file system. It could be from a hard disk and then I CD into another directory, and now suddenly I may be transparently accessing a solid state drive. So this really is what is happening when we are utilizing our virtual file system. It allows us to easily move around transparently. So like I say, I go into the root directory, I do an ls, right now I'm accessing partition 5, I go into cd boot, suddenly I'm now accessing partition number 1. But to you as the end user, it is presented to you as the virtual file system, and all of this switching around between physical devices happens really without your knowledge, behind the curtain under the hood. Now if you happen to be using maybe say a Windows device, you might notice things are a little bit more explicit. You can see here we have clearly delineated disks, disk C, and we could go in and browse through that disk, or we could go into disk D, which is another disk entirely, and then browse files within that. But it's much more explicit when we happen to use the Linux file system. You could just be changing directory quickly and be flipping through disks without ever really knowing about it. So one thing I would say is that when we want to mount a particular file system, it is very important that we mount this within a directory within the directory tree structure, and we want that directory to be empty. Now the reason why is this, and it's not because you can't mount into a directory which does have particular files or further directories, further subdirectories should I say. It's just that if you happen to mount into a directory which already has files and folders, those files and folders will suddenly become inaccessible. Not that they're deleted or anything like that, it just means that while the file system happens to be mounted in that directory, you're not going to be able to access anything within that existed prior. So imagine if you happen to have some important files, some critical files, and you mount a file system into that very same directory. Those critical files, you're not going to be able to touch them until you unmount that file system. So really, it's not an enforced rule, it just really is something that you want to self-impose for your own best practice. So think about this. As I say, we have the root directory, and then we could have, the boot directory. And you will know that I have a home directory, cd home. And within my home directory, I have a folder under my username called IPv0. And within this directory here, if I so chose, I could just use the command mkdir to create a new directory. Maybe just call this backup and make it an empty directory. And what I could do, I could have another disk and mount that disk within this directory right here. So this may be SDB partition 1, whereas the root directory that would be SDA partition 5, and the boot directory is going to be SDA partition 1. So that means if we go to our root directory, we are on the first disk, partition 5. If we go down to our home directory, we're still on disk 1, partition 5. Same again if we go into the IP0 folder. But if we happen to go into this newly created backup directory, suddenly and transparently, we would be reading from an entirely separate disk and the first partition of that disk. However, if we go back out to IPv0, we once again are on SDA5. But if we go into the boot directory, we would be on the same disk again, SDA1, i.e. the first disk, but we would now be switching to that first partition. So I really just want that process to be very clear, because very often people tend to get a little bit confused when first presented with this information. But once you get it, you absolutely get it, and it does make sense and stick. That is the good news. So I did say we would have a word about the file systems that are in play. What type of file system can we actually utilize with respect to Linux? Now, we will actually mention these file systems in a little bit more detail later on within this very course, but I do just want to give you a brief summary. So we have the file system ext2. This is based on the extended file system, the original one, ext, but this was an improvement, okay? And again, we'll talk about what those improvements are a little bit later on within this course. Next, we had ext3, again an improvement over its predecessor, ext2. And this allowed a type of logging feature known as journaling. Why that is important, again, we will certainly see that very shortly. Then we have ext4. This again provided the benefits of ext3, i.e. we still get journaling, but it provides other features, very important features, such as allowing for much larger file systems. And this one happens to be a very common file system used in modern Linux systems. Now, moving on from the ext file systems, we also have the XFS file system. This one is all about high performance. That really was the design goal of this file system, and it does live up to its promise. Next, we have what is called the BTR-FS. This again is all about size, and this was designed to deal with very large data devices. So large. And like I say, we do have even more file systems to explore later on. Now, I just wanted to mention the different types of file system because right now, in order to demonstrate the mounting and unmounting of our file systems as we move throughout this very skill, what I want to do is to actually add another disk entirely. Now, you can actually do this on different types of virtual machines, VMware if you so choose. I happen to have a VirtualBox device, or a VirtualBox instance, should I say. So I'm just going to add that right now. So what I'll do here is I'll just minimize this and I'll open up VirtualBox. And in fact, before I do anything, what I'm going to do is I'll shut down my machine, forgetting the sudo command as always. Type in the password. Okay, so that should be shutting down the machine. What I will do is I'll go to my VirtualBox machine right now, and I'm going to click the settings button, okay? Now if I go to storage and I choose SATA, what I'm going to do is to click this icon here, add new storage attachment. If I click this, I'm going to choose a hard disk. Now what I'll do here is I'll just click create right now, and I'll choose next here. I'll make it a dynamically allocated hard disk. I'll just make the size, maybe just say, I don't know, like 1 gig or something like that. Doesn't really matter the size so much. And I will create this. Now what I will do is I'll scroll on down. I will select this option right here, VDI. We can actually see the size right here. And I will click choose. So now I've actually added a second disk. So what I will do now is I'll click OK. And then I'll turn back on my machine. So I'll click start right here. And the machine is just powering on. Okay, so I'll go in and open up a terminal right here. So if I go in to my dev directory right now, and I do an ls, in fact, let me just grep for SD, and remember the grep command, John, there we go. So what we can now see here is because I've added this second disk, I don't just have SDA1, which has these different partitions. I have this new one here, SDB. This is the second disk I've just added. Now what I want to do here is I actually want to give this disk a partition because right now it's just SDB, no partitions available. Now the command I can use to give this disk a partition is fdisk. So what I will do here is I'll just say sudo fdisk and I'll do -l for a list, type in my password, and we can see here, like I say, the very first disk right here, it has partitions, this one here, no partitions at all as of yet. So the name is SDB, and this is what we're going to use. We're going to say sudo fdisk, and I'll say dev SDB. So if I hit enter here, notice it says we have to type a particular command. Now the command I can use is the M command for help, so I'll say M and then enter. And if we scroll on down, or rather scroll on up, we can see these different options here. So if I do L, we can actually see the partition types. So I can say L here, hit enter. So the partition type I would like would be 83, which would be for Linux. So what I'll do is I'll say M for help again. If I say N, this will allow me to create a new partition. So I'll say N right here. The type of partition I want, I will have a primary partition. I'll say P and hit enter. The partition number, if I have the default 1, that means we will have SDB1, the first partition. So I'll just say 1 and hit enter. The first sector, 2048, leave it at default. The last sector, again, leave it at the default. Now it is auto-detected the type as Linux, and it's going to be the entire size of the disk, 1.2 gig. Now if I actually want to keep these changes and write them so that they do take effect, what I need to do is to say W, because as we see here, this is going to allow us to write the table to disk and exit. So that's exactly what I'll do. So now the partition has been created. If I do sudo fdisk -l, notice now we have a little number on the end, SDB1. We now have a partition. And now that we have a partition, we want to give this partition a file system. Now, like I say, I'm not going to go into too much detail in this command right now. We'll talk about file systems in more detail, but we did see that we have a file system called ext4, and I'm going to use this command to make a file system using ext4. So I'll say mkfs.ext4, and then I'll just target the partition. So it's in the dev directory, it's going to be SDB, which is my new disk, and partition number 1. That is the partition we want to put this file system onto. So if I hit enter now we should have a file system here. If I do my fdisk-l, we have our partition, we have the type of Linux, and we are ready to use this partition with this file system, and we can begin practicing the mounting and unmounting of this partition in different locations within our virtual file system. So that was a lot to get to in the opening of this skill. The next thing we're going to be tackling is manually mounting this new partition or this new file system using the mount command, and that is what we're going to be doing in the very next nugget. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.